A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So I might as well go on ahead and do something a bit different here. While I have talked about this series mostly focusing on the older aspects of video games, ones that I have gotten a good amount of memories of, ones that I had gotten some more recent ROMs of, including on the PS5, ones that I've gotten good recollection of over the years, I figured that some newer games, especially ones that were basically not utilized in other media, including HDN graphics and super graphics, probably ought to have their own video for the entirety of this channel as a whole. One of these examples would probably have to be the late 2023 entry known as Dave the Diver. This was yet another popular case of an indie company known as Mint Rocket this time around, creating their own video game as a means of becoming a popular hit amongst critics, fans, and gamers alike. Dave the Diver, of course, wasn't exactly the first type of game to utilize underwater sea diving and fishing, harpoon launching, gardening, farming, and managing a restaurant. But this was in fact the culmination of a number of different gameplay varieties coming together into forming a pretty epic storyline. Probably one of the best that I would have to say for 2023 and 2024, especially when you consider the fact that going all the way up to the point where the final act had shown up a few months back. And to tell you the truth, the more recent updates that have come around, including the more recent collaboration with such other franchises like Dredge, for instance, as well as Balatro, that's only a small handful of what we can possibly expect. Full-on collaboration with other well-known games that we've gotten in more recent years do seem to be happening in some ways, but probably none so much of significance as Dave the Diver, because they were able to straight up rip off these other games and practically parodize them in their own way, or potentially turn them up as a means of comedy. No matter which way you look at it though, Dave the Diver was quite a story. It begins with a guy named Dave lying down on the beach, getting a phone call from an old friend of his named Cobra. He tells him to come around for some sushi, but then the two basically talk it out, and well, it turns out this sushi restaurant is looking to have a man go down into a special underwater location called the Blue Hole. And this restaurant owner is in fact owned by a legendary sushi crafter known as Bancho. This man, I kid you not, he is quite a character. Probably so popular, that's why I've officially given my PS5 Slim the name Bancho. Yeah, I literally named him after him. But apart from real life connections that I can bring up here, the character Bancho himself is an expert sushi maker and has had many years of experience as well as some unique flavor profiles to deliver to the many restaurant customers that come around at Bancho Sushi. Located in the Blue Hole, it's certainly one that's going to be a feast for the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and possibly everything else. His sushi was unlike anything that could have possibly ever been created. But there was basically a catch in all this. Cobra especially wanted good old Dave to come around to go fishing at the Blue Hole, basically, utilizing his diving experience as a means to gather up some fish and then have them cooked up in sushi for the restaurant. And that's essentially what the main point of the game is all about. Gathering fish from the Blue Hole and using that said fish to create sushi. And the sushi will be fed to the customers, and the customers will leave behind big tips, allowing for profits to skyrocket, as Cobra himself would probably want. And then of course, the restaurant should grow bigger over time, more customers will show up, and repeat said process for as long as possible. However, this is not exactly the whole main story revolving around the game, but it is still an important part for business. After all, for every single day that Dave goes down diving into the depths of the Blue Hole, he is meant to capture all sorts of fish. You have clownfish, blue tang, some crawfish, lobsters, squids, crabs. a good variety of different sea creatures that you can find down there. Whole octopus even, eels, sharks, stingrays, and even prehistoric creatures that are somehow still alive after millions of years. Well, we'll get to some of the other parts later. Anyways though, for the uppermost parts of the blue hole, you have some of the more common fish that swim around the depths of the oceans. Lots of smaller fish for the most part. Fish that aren't exactly as worth it as most other fish probably would be if you dove down even deeper. However, Dave's equipment can only last for so long and so well. His oxygen tank starts out pretty small, his diving suit doesn't allow him to go very far, and he also doesn't have that powerful of a harpoon. Which is okay because there are RPG elements that you can use here. But instead of a progression system like normal, where it works by XP, you actually utilize the money gathered from the restaurant as a means of getting a hold of better equipment. The money can also be used for a variety of upgrades within the restaurant, including some new decorations, furniture, etc. And there's also, later on, the option for you to hire some people and have them work at the restaurant, which is exactly what I was able to do. Over time, though, the story does eventually evolve into a gun manufacturer named Duff, whom is also a fan of anime girls, like some of us probably are. There's also Dr. Bacon, whom is well known in the field of biology. He is mostly responsible for analyzing a lot of the creatures underwater and determining who's out there. And there was also a guy who collects cars and comes around on a paddle boat occasionally to check on your collection. There was also a photographer who comes around and also assigns you special tasks of which that you can earn special money for. And there is also a variety of other characters here and there. You do get a good variety of different characters to work with, so many of which that it'd be impossible to truly count the true definition of which. There was an old friend of Bancho, for instance, in which that he talks about a backstory in which that he tried to serve shark head over to a certain celebrity whom came over to a restaurant that he used to work for. But she was disgusted by the idea of eating shark's head. But that, of course, was a story that would happen later on with some of the characters coming back and actually trying the shark's head. Yeah. So talk about the past coming back only to eventually realize for themselves how badly they misjudged Mr. Bancho. And on top of all that, we definitely can't forget about the conspiracy theorist. A guy whom apparently is running some sort of organization and is even equipped with certain military-grade technology, but is mostly as a saboteur slash main bad guy whom goes after Dave on some occasions. There's a few times where you engage in boss battles with him as well. I mean, he has his own diving suit, some missiles and torpedoes that you gotta avoid. He has his own sub with its own weapons equipped. He's got an armored suit even. Yeah, it's just crazy. The fact you fight this guy many times over in the story is a little ridiculous. But that's the thing about certain antagonist characters. They just never seem to go away. Meaning you have to deal with them until the bitter end. So, that's a great example of how many characters are around in the story. But that's not all, because as you go further into the story, there are some more that do show up even. There's a guy named Otto, who runs his own farm, and eventually creates a fresh new one near the restaurant for you to work at. He also owns a hatchery in which that you can check up on with 9 different tanks encompassing 9 different levels of ocean depths, ranging from 0 meters to over 500 meters. Depending on how far into the depths that you go, you can expect some of the fish that you've collected to have eggs within, so that way you can take to the hatchery, and sometimes these eggs will result in certain breeding that goes around. The hatchery, of course, can allow for a large amounts of fish from each of these ocean depth territories within the blue hole or otherwise to be stored within. You can always purchase additional storage if you want, and then you can also sell any of the fish that are in the tanks, or even use them for the restaurant as additional ingredients. But there also comes a point later on in the story where an additional location's opened. Yeah, a second restaurant. You have to basically situate it with an entirely different crew, and while unfortunately you don't quite get to work in the second location, or the sister location as most of us would refer to it, it's mostly with the main location that you get to work at. And speaking of working, I might as well go into detail on how the shifts work each night. Because every time the restaurant opens up, especially the main one, what Dave has to do is he's got to serve the sushi alongside most of the others. He doesn't really cook like Bancho, so he's mostly there as a server for the restaurant. The services that Dave puts together are mostly about serving the food that Bancho cooks up. A gauge, of course, will fill up on the right, determining how long they take to prep, and what you got to do is pick up each order. Of course, if there's other servers around, they can also pick up the orders for you and automatically deliver them to each customer. But let's face it, these customers are, in fact, infatuated with time, because after all, the place does open up at 10 p.m. and closes within a few hours. So they basically have to rake in a lot of customers. And with these customers itching to get out as soon as possible, it's one of those little things. I have talked about a few other games that do rely on time, and it seems to be a common running theme here. As even in real life, some restaurants have to really scramble together in order to get their customer service done on time, and sometimes even ahead of them. In any case though, apart from regular food that Dave serves out, there's also the option to pour in some green tea and to also serve up some beer and even create some cocktails. So you do get a variety of good drinks as an add-on to work with here, but of course you do have to pay attention to the instructions in mind. For instance, a cocktail needs to be filled up with the blue, red, or yellow in the correct formation and in the correct size. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Beer, of course, is as simple as allowing for bank shots and allowing for a little amount of foam at the top. And as for green tea, fill up to the line above. But in due time, you can in fact get your services done then. For the most part, there's also the fact that the employees around the restaurant, as well as the sister location, they can also be trained in a good amount, provided that you have enough money to pay for them. And there's also the menus themselves, which you can put together, as Bancho himself has lots of recipes that you can unlock with Artisan's Flames, which are mostly earned depending on how good your services were at each night. Customers will of course rate the restaurant based on the items they served and how good of a job they did. Typically it's done via percentage, but also by how much profits were raked in. So I will say I've had really good nights full of sushi, especially because I took as much advantage in the blue hole as possible. But then of course, with the sister location, like I've said, you don't really get to work in that area, but you can organize who gets to work there and also what menu items can be put over there as well. And mostly because of materials that you can send out. Ingredients for the most part can be shipped out, whether it's from the hatchery or even from the farm. Now, why don't we go ahead and talk a bit about the hatchery and farm themselves. I've said that the hatchery does contain 9 different wells regarding 9 different depth levels of fish, and many of which can be anywhere from 30 meters to over 500 meters. And this typically has something to do with the glacier segments of the blue hole itself, which is considered the deepest portion yet that you can explore. Of course, you do have to have an insulated diving suit in order to get down that depth, which comes later. And as for the farm, Otto, of course, does allow you to do work as is with a large plant made specifically for rice, in which that you occasionally have to pull up weeds. And there's also a water segment in the back, which you can fill up your water can, and basically up to 5 rows of crops can be put together. The crops themselves can vary from cucumbers, tomatoes, eggplants, onions, garlic, etc. And sometimes other things can also be put together as a means to speed the growth or improve the quality of the product. And then of course there's Sammy, Otto's son, whom is an iconic hip-hop star, whom eventually does help work with his father and for the restaurant. He mainly does so by bringing in a large chicken coop. And this chicken coop can also be upgraded much like the other things in the farm and the hatchery, in which that you can basically get a hold of better hens, better chickens for better quality eggs, as well as upgrade the hatchery, as well as the feed system. It can automatically feed for up to 3 days straight. And then of course there's even the amounts of food that gets put in, not to mention the quality of it. But so long as you have enough money for each of these different variants, you can expect to have some great results yielded every single day that you go to check on the farm, the hatchery, and then of course with the restaurants, having as much to work with as you could probably desire. So in my experiences, I'd say I've had a lot of fill in all ways possible. The hatchery definitely provided lots of ingredients for me, both for the sushi restaurants and the sister location. So they both had their fill in terms of whatever fish were all around these different depths. But back to the storyline. Remember when I said that there was basically this organization that's out to sabotage Dave's mission? Well, it's not just about managing the sushi restaurant. It's also because Dr. Bacon had supposedly gotten a hunch about some ancient city that used to exist down in the depths of the ocean. The blue hole itself apparently used to be home to sea people, basically like mermaids in a way. And there happens to be an entire city full of them. Yeah, at some point you actually encounter a small hiding spot in which that you find two of them. Unfortunately, one ends up injured and the other is unfortunately unable to speak your own language. You eventually get a hold of a translator that Bacon gives out to him, and Dave is able to successfully communicate with the people themselves. The sea people are eventually kind enough to allow Dave to enter their city, and wouldn't you know, they happen to be quite welcoming. Especially because Dave has actually done a good amount of things for them. There was actually a couple of different missions as well as entire story acts that do revolve around the safety, welfare, and history of the Sea People's own city. One of the main things that's gone wrong were temperature changes. Yeah, apparently the place needed to be nice and cold, but apparently something's gone wrong with it. And you eventually find out by going down into the glacier portion of the depths, which are over 500 meters deep. And this segment is known to be very cold, so the king of the sea people is actually able to help craft you a special diving suit so that Dave can actually get down that far. Yeah, the further he goes, the more cold it gets. However, there eventually does come a point where there's supposed warmth generating from that level. And apparently while that suit is made to counteract against the cold, it's apparently not meant for heat. So that's one other thing to keep in mind on that part. But you know what? Being that more than 50 hours had passed by the time I was eventually able to find out how to get down to the very bottom, where the true end happens to be, yeah. The thing is, while Dave's own company is able to eventually get down to a certain door that happens to be jammed in a way, a machine is able to use the laser technology to slice through the obstructions and help open the door for him so Dave can get down and deal with the monster whom is behind all this. Yeah, I bet you didn't notice that in the very end, while there actually were a good number of opponents that we fought up until this very point, including prehistoric animals, I mean, a Tylosaurus, for crying out loud. That thing was crazy. Who would have thought an extinct animal would somehow make its way into a modern day contemporary environment? I mean, it was crazy enough that such creatures like the Dunkleosteus even made its way through. But a Tylosaurus? No, but it's even more crazy when you get to realize that after you kill the Tylo, you know what happens? You reach into its neck and rip out its thyroid gland. Yeah. An entire thyroid from the Tylosaurus. And somehow that gets put into a functional meal. I mean, that's not the first time that in a boss battle, the boss's own corpse was apparently salvaged for whatever edible bits were there. I mean, that's actually kind of funny. Imagine killing a beautiful prehistoric monster and then chiseling off whatever is edible from it as a souvenir. I mean, who would have known? I would expect Jurassic World to have a raptor, I guess, get destroyed, and then eventually its sickled claw on its toe would be sliced off as a keepsake. I mean, it's kind of like how in the earlier Jurassic Park films, we've seen Hammond with a cane topped with a piece of amber with a mosquito inside. Basically solidifying the idea that mosquitoes did harbor dinosaur blood millions of years ago. Which, I don't know. If this fossilized amber supposedly had mosquitoes in it with blood that old, that could be one of a kind. Anyways, though, we do eventually get to the point, though, where Dave encounters the final boss. The very, very final boss. Especially after going some nice hot depths, evading a lot of enemies, carrying lots of stones and a lot of fruits to help reflect light. Yeah, fruit that is apparently so sacred to the sea people that it can actually reflect or bend light. But you know what? That's still a pretty good puzzle element that they put together here. You're using fruit to direct light in order to open up or close paths. And they also has the idea of being able to work your way around a certain maze. In fact, some of the sea people do allow for Dave to get around certain places. Some old catacombs, for instance, where there apparently were some undead sea people, thanks to a certain epidemic that broke out long ago. Yeah, they had apparently been rolling around for thousands of years, supposedly. These decrepit corpses are all running around in the dark, and Dave is there just trying to find his way through. Yeah. But you know what, though? This final boss at least actually has a bit more originality to it than we would have even suspected. Seriously. This final boss is insane. And we have certainly faced a lot of unique bosses by this point. I mean, some were even considered to be more mini bosses. There were many sharks, there were some rays, there was even a helicoprion. Yeah. That was one unique piece. But up until this very point, we have encountered a lot of crazy sea creatures. Both old and new, young, old, small, large, prehistoric, or common in this very day and age. But this kind of thing that we have here, this was in fact an ancient being that once terrorized the sea people. And the fact that we got Dave, a man whom is basically from modern times, facing against such an ancient entity like this? Talk about quite an ending. Imagine if I had to face up against something like, I don't know, Extreme Curse from possibly Egyptian times. I mean, then again, we could probably look at Brendan Fraser on that part. It's that unique idea where modern times happens to cross into ancient history, where it rises up after thousands of years, and people of today have to stop it. It's that kind of idea that I do appreciate pretty well. Anyways, though, while this boss fight is almost as tough as the rest, it certainly wasn't much of a pushover. But it also wasn't much of a cakewalk either. And in the end, this is, believe it or not, where we get the true ending. Wow, just think about it. We've had Bancho dealing with some old clients and disappointing a certain celebrity along the way, and eventually opening up his own restaurant to cater into his special talent, his auteur craftsmanship in the art of sushi. We've had sushi contests with other sushi masters. We've had Dave diving down into the blue hole, and we've had Cobra practically being in charge of the whole business here. We've had Otto and Sammy basically regulating their own services for hatchery and farmer-based needs. We've had Dr. Bacon supplying his own scientific explanations about the sea people themselves, and the many sea people characters that were out there had a lot of their own tropes and their unique quirks and personalities given to them. But in the end, with all that has happened here, all these workers we've hired, all this sushi that Bancho had crafted for us to work with, to feed all of these customers that came to the restaurant, as well as a sister location. And then, of course, these bosses. Up until this very point, I'd say at least 2.5 days worth of overall gameplay came together. 60 hours. That's a lot to work with, don't you think? But in the end, I'd say Mint Rocket certainly went out of their way here. And from what I heard, there's actually going to be another update to the game with some special upgrades. Honestly, I don't quite really see myself needing to do something like that. Because I've already beaten the entirety of the game, and I've completed a lot of different stuff. Mostly side quests and even some special missions that were, of course, going to a certain marine biologist. But hey, it's still a fantastic game. Something I would recommend for everybody out there. And being less than 2 years old since its original release, Dave the Diver was certainly one of the best of 2023. And I have found lots of games over the years. And 2023 has got to be the best, period. I mean, it's not just Dave the Diver that I've talked about, but think about it. There was also Daymare 1994 Sandcastle, Hellboy Web of Weird, Disney Speedstorm, Grounded, just to name a few. So with all that in mind, Dave the Diver, for all of its excellence in the arts of fishing, exploration, puzzles, mini-games, side quests, serving sushi, as well as the unique arts of challenge inside of a restaurant in general, and with lots of other tropes to work with, lots of other unique gameplay mechanics and environments, it all culminates to unique scoring from me. 8.9 out of 10.1 for this one. So, I'd say that more than satisfies me in this whole perspective of the entirety of such a unique game coming from an indie developer in the Northeast Pacific. So, with that in mind, thank you guys very much for watching this segment. I'll come back tomorrow with another piece of video games that are totally awesome. And make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.